Hi, everybody. Welcome back. That was a really great poster session. I'm really happy to introduce Mounya Elhilali here. Back when I met her, speech people were using features that were, the closest thing you could say that they did to neurally inspired features, maybe like 24-dimensional Mel spectra. And Mounya, meanwhile, is using very high-dimensional, very interesting, neurally inspired features to do interesting things. And so I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. She's an associate professor at Hopkins right now and did her previous work at University of Maryland. And, well, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So thank you for having me tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing in my lab. So we're interested in the cocktail party problem. As obviously in the talk, I just want to acknowledge that this is work by my current and former PhD students. Ashwin has done most of the work I'll be presenting along with Mike and some work of Deb as well. So the cocktail party problem, as we've heard at least in a few of the talks earlier today, it sort of refers to the general premise of how we're dealing with multiple sounds present at the same time. The one thing I wanted to emphasize is there is the source separation aspect of the cocktail party problem. That is certainly true. How can we separate speaker 1 from speaker 2? But I think we want to think of it as a more general problem that has to do with our ability to parse the soundscape that surrounds us. And in a great way, and I think this was mentioned in the first talk today, it's very similar to sort of scene segmentation. So it may be about separating different objects, but it may also have deal with tracking them, identifying them, discrimination, detection. So a lot of these problems are inherent to the cocktail party problem. So now, why is it referred to as a problem? We know many of the reasons why it is a problem. Sounds have no spatial layout. They come to our ear combined on top of each other, and it's part of our job or our brain's job. And if we're building models, our model's job is to separate or to figure out the spatial layout unless we have multiple microphone information. Sounds have no trivial contours or shapes. This is one of the other challenges that separates auditory scenes from visual scenes. Sounds evolve over time, so this is again, one of the distinctions that one can put between audio signals and images, especially static images. If you miss the signal, you can't go back and listen to it unless you're doing non-causal processing. And most importantly, and that's the core to what I'm trying to get to in this talk, is that listening is an active process. So this is a quote from Not Handel, the musician. This is in 1989, that basically says, I'm just going to read it to you, that listening is not the same as hearing. Listening is an active process in which our experiences, goals, expectations constrain and control our percepts in complex ways. So the fact that you're familiar with language is biased in how you're hearing me right now. If I were speaking a different language, you would be able to follow my voice. But if we were in a noisy setting, you may have different challenges dealing with that. And so that's those kinds of additional pieces of information that your brain uses are one of the things that we're trying to understand. What is it about this active process that helps our brain deal with multiple scenarios that are relevant to the cocktail party problem? Now, what we know about the biological auditory system is, sound comes in and it travels through different stages from your ear all the way to auditory cortex and beyond. And, sort of decades of work have pointed out to a few things, few key transformations that happen that have to do a lot with some sort of feature extraction. By the time you get to auditory cortex, then you start presumably building some kind of representation of your auditory objects. Now, auditory cortex is one of the key places that we're interested in exploring the cocktail party problem at, because this is where we believe some of this construction of auditory objects start taking place. So one of the many ways that people have explored sort of this is another view of a schematic of the auditory system. Again, having two ears, sound comes in, and it travels through different stages all the way to auditory cortex. Now, this was again mentioned in one of the talks earlier. We get a good readout of what goes on at these different stages by basically recording at different stages and trying to understand what went on when sound came in, and then we record some sort of neural activity. And central to this process is the concept of a receptive field, or an STRF. Because this is important to my talk, I'll just tell you a little bit about how this is done. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with it. The concept of a spectrotemporal receptive field is very much related to a transfer function. So you basically play a sound, you record, you stick an electrode somewhere in the brain, hopefully near a neuron in auditory cortex, you record some neural activity, and part of what you're trying to do is you think of this as some kind of black box. Sound came in, output came out, what transformation happened in between. That's one of the sort of classic ways that people have tried to understand the processing that goes on at different stages in neural circuits. And so using systems theory, you can write this output as a mapping from the input through some transfer function. There have been many techniques. The most sort of general way you can write this is as a Volterra kernel or Volterra series transformation, basically that the signal comes in and it gets transformed through different kernels depending how complex the system is. And that should give you a complete representation of what happened from the stimulus to the output. Now, the STRF, the spectrotemporal response field or receptive field, is a method that is used in this spirit. It's just that it uses basically the second order Volterra kernel, and this is the basic function that you can use to measure that kernel. Think of it as a reverse correlation between your input and your output. You're just trying to get a readout of the transfer function. What is the function that happened, or the transformation that happened? So, and that's the neural transfer function, the spectrotemporal receptive field, or referred to as the STRF. Now, when you look at STRFs measured at the level of auditory cortex, what I'm showing you here are 6 individual neurons. So these are 6 different locations in auditory cortex. This is data that was recorded in ferrets, but similar data has been recorded in many mammals. What you're looking at, just to orient you, is x-axis is time, y-axis is frequency, green is sort of baseline activity of this one neuron, red is excitatory responses, and blue is inhibition. And basically the way to read this out is this is the filter parameters that this one neuron likes to respond to in sound. So when sound comes in and it has some strong activity around maybe 1 kilohertz, then this neuron is likely to respond, while this neuron prefers 4 kilohertz kinds of sounds. This is a kind of sort of transient detector. So this is a neuron that would be very active if you have a pattern in your input that has this kind of sort of low, high kind of energy. Some neurons tend to be oriented. They tend to detect sort of spectrotemporal patterns. In this case, this is a pattern that's going like this. You can get the opposite kind of pattern. So we're looking at 6 individual neurons, but now imagine you have billions of these. So you have a whole network that takes the input and maps it through these different individual filters. Think of them as just different lenses through which our auditory system views the input signal. And by mapping the signal through these different, so an array of these STRFs, you get some kind of high dimensional mapping that the brain mines to basically help us perceive sound. Now, in a great way, so this is just another way of thinking about what the STRFs do. This is a spectrogram, and imagine that you are tiling the space of time frequency with different resolutions, both in time and frequency, that give you details of the different patterns in the signal. In many ways, this is very similar to how current deep learning structures work. This is just a figure that I took because it sort of has this kind of parallel multi-resolution view, but many configurations of deep neural networks work in similar ways. They take the input spectrogram and look at it through different lenses as you go through the different stages. The multi-resolution view is one that is crucial to allow us to not only pick out the details, but also, if you think of the problem of source separation, allow us to map these different sources through different neural substructures. Now, we think of this pipeline as basically the same way as a deep neural network would work. Sound comes in, it goes through some early analysis, then some sort of deeper embeddings, and then the output of the network comes out. And in a great way, the auditory system or the brain works the same way. The audio signal comes in. There is some sensory analysis that is more focused on the signal that is picked up by the senses in our ears, some higher level processing that happens, and then our auditory objects and perception forms. Now, what happens when we're paying attention? So what I wanted to focus on in this talk is attention at the cocktail party. So now, just to be specific, the kinds of attention that we're talking about is the one that we naturally use when we're having a conversation. You were trying to listen to the posters. There is sound behind you, next to you, other kinds of sounds. And you're using your cognitive processes to help you hone in on the conversation you're having with the poster presenter and try to ignore what's going on, the other sounds that are going on in the environment. Now, we do know that the way the brain does this business of attention is through some sort of feedback. So the setup of how the processing pipeline works is really as a closed loop system. It's not sound comes in, features get extracted, and then magic happens at the end. Yes, that is the core part of the processing, but feedback, and we do know that in the actual diagram of the auditory system, there are estimates that there are about 10 times as many arrows pointing down as there are arrows pointing up, which actually suggests that feedback at different stages plays a big role in how we bias the processing in this core pipeline. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of the studies that have gone on trying to explore what kind of feedback, how this feedback affects this processing pipeline, but we do know a few things, and they are important for us, at least for the current talk. So we know that feedback affects the sensory analysis. So remember these STRFs that I just mentioned. So we know that the auditory cortex is made up of these different neurons, and they have different selectivities to different spectral and temporal patterns. What we also know, those are recordings that were done in animals that were just sitting there passively listening to sound. Now, if you engage the attentional circuits of animals, the way you do that is you train them to do a task, to pay attention to a certain sound, to ignore other sounds. So this is a picture of the same kinds of STRF, again, just to orient you, time on x-axis, frequency on the y-axis. So this is a recording of an STRF at the level of auditory cortex, what we're calling here a passive STRF. This was recorded when the animal was just passively listening to sound. We use these sort of reverse correlation to map out what the transfer function of that particular neuron in auditory cortex is. Now, when the animal engages in a task, in this particular case, this is a simple task. The animal is paying attention to a pure tone. So it listens to a few noises, and then occasionally a tone plays out, and then it has to detect the presence of a tone. It's a fairly simple task. But what you observe is that the individual neurons at the level of auditory cortex start changing their filter properties. So in this particular case, you see this little red area, excitation grow near where the detection of the tone that is to be detected happens. Now, it is important to keep in mind that when these animals are engaged in a task, in this particular case, this animal is asked to react whenever they hear a 7 kilohertz tone. The individual neurons don't just swap out and go to 7 kilohertz. This is an animal that still has to live in its environment. So what you see is small changes to somehow improve or change the encoding of 7 kilohertz, because in this particular case it happens to be the target of attention. But globally, these neurons stay stable. They keep their main characteristics. It still has a strong response around here, but in this particular case, it grows this little area around this target detection. Now, you see similar kinds of changes if animals are asked to do different tasks. In this case, this is a discrimination task where the animal is asked to discriminate between two tone frequencies at 2 kilohertz and probably a 3 or 3.5 kilohertz in this case. So these are indicated with these two arrows. So again, this is what the filter properties look like when the animal is in a passive state. When the animal now engages in a discrimination task, you see these kinds of changes that seem to increase excitation around one of the tones, in this case a target tone, and decrease excitation or introduce more inhibition around the reference tone, shown here in the blue. The similar kinds of changes have been reported with other tasks. So if the animal now has to do a temporal task where it has to detect a gap in the sounds, then you see some changes in the temporal pattern of the response. This is another case where the animal has been trained to detect different click rates. So again, you see a change in the temporal pattern of the response. So there has been a series of studies that have been ongoing looking at these kind of adaptive changes to these STRFs, depending on the task that these animals are doing. These individual neurons, now I'm emphasizing this because this is, I think, something that is important to bear in mind. These are individual neurons in an entire network of billions of neurons, and they're each changing their tuning properties depending on what the attentional goals are or the feedback from the attentional task is. So this is one of the aspects that we know the feedback affects processing at the level of sensory analysis. We know that there are many studies have looked at higher level processing. This is not something that I'm going to touch on in this talk, but we know that there are changes both at different brain areas that also are driven by attention, and there have been some work, actually, even some posters that try to read out brain responses from different channels across the head when humans are asked to pay attention to one speaker versus the other. A third aspect of how attention affects, attentional feedback affects the changes in the basic pipeline is through modulating the correlation between how different channels respond. So there has been some recent work, again, in this case with animal recordings, and the key idea is when animals are trying to pay attention to sound, that the activation across different channels, in this case we're looking at time frequency, depending on whether these different channels belong to the same object or not, we see that somehow there is a working memory component in the way the brain represents these different objects that affects not just the individual frequency channels or these individual neurons or STRFs, but also the connectivity between them in such a way that helps the brain not only represent sound in this high-dimensional space, but figure out what bits of the space go with what. So what we wanted to do in sort of trying to make sense of what does attention really do at the cocktail party setting, how does it help, how does this feedback help the processing pipeline, help our brain do better in terms of detecting targets of interest. I'm just going to emphasize one more time that the kinds of adaptations we're talking about are not these kinds of adaptations, many of whom that have been used in sort of machine learning kind of techniques. These are not kind of, you've represented this space and now you need to adapt it to different settings. These are adaptations that somehow change the representation itself. So your actual features, think of them as your MFCCs, for example, are now not exactly the same. They have been changed depending on what the goals are. So we're not changing the models necessarily per se, though these change. Certainly at the higher level processing, attention does change your models, but there is also changes in the actual features themselves. So one of the questions we wanted to ask is, how does this neural adaptation help the system perform better in a case, for example, of target detection? Think of it as, for example, speech and noise. How do you detect speech better if you're really trying to pay attention to speech? Now, thinking of this basic pipeline, the stimulus comes in, we get this kind of sensory encoding that represents for us in some high-dimensional perceptual space our targets and our maskers. Now, if we introduce a feedback signal, and now we're trying to pay attention to our target, in this case, let's say speech, how would that feedback help us change the basic feature representation such that we can do better at detecting speech and noise? The way we do that is sort of we've implemented different models of how we can introduce or model this kind of plasticity or adaptation. So imagine you start with an initial set of these receptive fields, H0 or H0, and we want to introduce some feedback so that we can retune these filters to adapt in such a way that they should give us a better representation of our target. So again, this is the same view. So what we started with is we took STRFs that were recorded in actual passive ferrets. So these are real neurophysiological receptive fields. We stacked a whole array of them together. we take a signal in, say speech and noise. We map them through these receptive fields, and through this mapping, we can represent the space of speech and the space of noise. So imagine that you have some kind of discriminative boundary here, W, between the two. And what we do is we come up with a simple cost function. Can we change these receptive fields from H0 to H adapted such that we can increase the discriminability between target and masker? But we also have to have some kind of stability in the representation. This is a key component. Your brain does not rewire just because you're paying attention to my voice. It really just adapts a little bit to help you, but the basic structure is still there so that if you decide to pay attention to something else, you will adapt towards that other representation. It's not a complete rewiring, so we want to have a balance of discriminability and stability in this representation. So we just map this to a very simple logistic regression cost function. So again, we're trying to retune to introduce little changes to each of these filters with the ultimate goal to improve discrimination between our two classes. But at the same time, we want to stay as close as possible to the original filter. So it's a kind of a balancing act between these two. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring these two representations further apart from each other. So as I said, we're not adapting the actual models here. We're adapting the actual filters that should give us a better representation. And sorry, let me just put this here. There we go. So, so we can actually, so I'll just walk you first through some of what the model can do in terms of replicating physiological data. So on the left, on the right here is the data that was recorded in a real brain of an animal that is behaving for these different tasks. And on the left is what the model is able to replicate. So in a sequence, this would be sort of a passive STRF. And then when the animal now engages in a tone detection, you see this little area grows. This is just the difference between these two to look at the difference. And overall, if we focus on the bottom plot, these are the kind of changes that you would observe if the brain is trying to detect a particular tone. The net effect through a whole population of neurons is that you see some increased excitation, and the same thing is able to be replicated by the model. We can do the same thing. So these are replicating actual studies that were done with these animals. This is a case of tone discrimination where you have a target tone and a reference tone. And so we also, so in the animals, people have reported an increased excitation around the attended target and increased inhibition, sort of a change in the opposite direction for the reference. And we see kind of similar changes from the model behavior. This one is a little bit more of a complicated task, especially for animals, to detect a change in sort of an FM up versus FM down. And in that case, you don't see particular changes in a time bin or in a frequency bin, but you see changes in the orientation of these neurons, up versus down. And we kind of sort of can replicate similar kind of behavior. So all of these are fairly simple tasks. They're simple because it is not trivial to train animals on very complicated tasks, though there have been some interesting recent work getting animals to do a little bit more elaborate tasks. Now, we wanted to ask, well, what is the implication of these retuned models in an actual sort of speech detection task? So we did a fairly simple test here because you want to keep in mind that we started with, so our model is not a sort of a processing pipeline with all the bells and whistles. This is a processing pipeline that has the stimulus to a spectrogram, and then we have STRFs that were taken from an actual brain. So we don't have a full mapping of, this is not entire auditory cortex. We're not including billions of these neurons, we're just including a few hundred of them. So our representation is limited by how many neurons we're using and what kind of features they're selective to. But we're still able to, we can ask the question of, if we now actually put speech, noisy speech through this processing pipeline, is it going to give us a better discrimination between speech and noise once this attentional feedback, in this case, the system is trying to pay attention to just speech, if it sees speech and noise, it tries to map it into a space that enhances the representation of speech and discriminates it further from noise. So we've done that with a simple sort of noisy, timid data set. The adaptation obviously is done within a matched noise condition, so it's not like it's trying to learn something about the noise. It's just trying to pay attention to speech. So these are kinds of results we get. So just to orient you here, this is the kind of performance in black here that we see with our baseline system. This is once we put in some adaptation, attentional feedback, we see noticeable improvement relative to the baseline. Now, these are nowhere near a state-of-the-art voice activity detector. This is not a system that has all the sort of the full mapping of the spectrotemporal space. This is a model that is using brain STRFs to map speech. So it has its own limitations. What we wanted to see is that the improvement, so this is the speech and the patterns here in dark, the dark curve is the one that is with the adapted STRFs. We see that it does improve detection in regions where speech can be more prominently detected. Now, overall, the kind of patterns that we see is attentional feedback does seem to enhance signal-to-noise ratio by improving discriminability. And the best way to summarize the effects we're seeing with this model is that if you start with a representation of your target and masker a certain way, after adaptation, you sort of push them apart from each other. So one of the ways we can interpret what attentional feedback is doing in the brain is that it helps us separate targets from maskers in a representation that improves discriminability. Now, one of the limitations of this model is we are using real biological STRFs. So we are limited in our choices of the time frequency selectivity to these actual physiological STRFs. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to alleviate this constraint. And to do that, we basically replaced these STRFs with Gabor filters. Now, there are two reasons we wanted to do that. One is because we wanted to tile the time frequency space with more freedom as opposed to the constraints of the physiological data. We're still choosing the parameters of these Gabors within a range that you would expect from auditory cortex STRFs, but we can now tile the space more consistently. We're sampling the space in a more consistent way than with just the actual physiological data. The other advantage of using the Gabor filters is they allow us more degrees of freedom. So we can not only improve the gain of these filters, but we can also change their orientation. We can change their tuning. So you know, we can have a scalar gain. This is what our linear model was doing. It was changing some sort of scalar gains around the STRFs, but now we can also explore these other parameters. The idea is still the same. Sound comes in, it gets mapped through this high dimensional space. We get some representations of targets and maskers, but now if we introduced some retuning of these filters in such a way to improve some objective function, so in this case, our objective function is still the same. Can we retune these filters to maximize detection? Here we define our objective function as a detection, sort of a D prime between speech and non-speech. So the general premise here is still sort of just trying to retune these filters. We happen to test it on speech and non-speech discrimination, but this is not something that this is not necessarily a constraint in this kind of a setup. So these are kind of results that we are obtaining. So what I'm showing you here are false positives against misdetection. So obviously lower on this corner is better. The different lines represent different models tested with kind of timid data sets with different noise types, other data sets that include more nonlinear distortions and different kinds of noises. The red curve here is, well, actually, so I'll show you the blue curve is our initial Gabor filter model. And we see that once we introduce the attentional feedback, we do see noticeable improvement relative to our initial set, and the other lines are other systems from the literature, just to give us a sense of how we compare to these other systems. Now, what is more interesting about this kind of model is not so much how close it comes to the state of the art, is really what does it do when the attentional feedback gets introduced. So to remind you, our earlier model that was more linear, it was sort of a gain-based model. Adjust the gain of your different filters. Would that help you get speech represented better than noise? With this other model, now that we allow more nonlinear changes in these filters, we observe this after the fact. We see that instead of changing the mean of the distributions, we notice that the likelihoods, the models actually seem to tighten. So this is not something that we built in the model. All we built in is we want these filters to be tuned in such a way to improve the detectability between two sources, a target and a masker. In the nonlinear case, we actually observe a tightening of these representations. In the linear case, we observe that they are pushed further apart. In this case, we observe that they tighten. So both of these strategies actually do make sense. You can solve the problem either this way or that way. If you want to increase discriminability, you can push the means apart, you can tighten your representation better, and both should lead to an improvement in detectability. Whether the brain implements a version more like this or a version more like that is still unclear, because the kinds of data that we have in terms of changes to these receptive fields still are with relatively simple tasks, and both these models will have similar predictions on these kinds of tasks. But this is something that we are continuing to explore to sort of get a better sense of what does the attentional feedback to our cortical representations really tries to achieve. Is it really a discriminability of this form or a discriminability of this form, or potentially both? Now, one of the other questions that we wanted to explore further in this work is we've started with this array of receptive fields, and that represents basically a network somewhere in our auditory cortex. This is still, in a way, limiting us in this kind of sort of two-case kind of problem. We're having this representation, and then we're trying to look at discriminability. So we thought, well, why not expand the network? We know that the cortical circuitry is not a sort of a single layer. Sound comes in, different filters analyze it, and then it goes to this high-dimensional space. Can we think of this in a more expanded network? So we sort of built a more distributed network. It still has a hierarchical structure, but sound comes in, and imagine we have just different layers of these receptive field processing units. Now, we don't have the kinds of data from brain recordings that would fill in an entire network like this, but we can use machine learning to help us fill this network. So what we did is we basically built an array of RBMs, of restricted Boltzmann machines. And the basic idea here is, can we use a sort of generative kind of model to learn representations of different kinds of sounds? So this is a network that is trained on just a random data set of all kinds of sounds, speech, music, natural data. And all it's trying to learn is a good representation of this network, of these data set at different resolutions. So the different nodes here, the only difference between them is just they are looking at data with different time resolutions or different pull-in parameters. And when we learn this network, we basically, what we're doing is we're just replicating our array of receptive fields at different points. The benefit of what we get from this network is now we can really have a more extended STRF space. One that is not constrained to be Gabor, but one that can actually map through a very large range of parameters, different resolutions represented by different nodes in the network, but we don't have the constraint of both the physiological data and the Gabor filters with their set of parameters. So now that we have access to a more extended cortical network, so to speak, we can now look at this question of correlation between individual nodes. So we've trained this network. As I said, this is not a network that is trained on any supervised task. This is just our way of representing an expanded cortical network. Now, can we look at individual neurons and see how they get activated relative to each other? So we can take individual nodes in this network, look at their activity over time, and now think about what we know attentional feedback does when it looks at activity across individual nodes. So one of the ways we know that cortical activity gets modulated with attention is through this concept of temporal coherence. So what temporal coherence says, and there was a nice poster about looking at this concept of common fate, how individual elements in a sound source move together when they belong to the same source, or elements that go together come from the same source. Elements that are not correlated with each other are likely to belong to different sources. So using this premise, we can now look at activity across the individual nodes. So this network has been trained, and it's already looking at different STRFs. And now we can look at the activity across the different nodes of the network and try to get a sense of how correlated individual nodes are relative to each other. Now, what we do know is when we pay attention to sound, to a particular sound source, the kinds of correlations between individual neurons that belong to that same source gets more enhanced, and the activity of neurons that does not belong to that source gets suppressed. So that's data we know from physiological results, and that's something we can think about implementing in this model. So to implement some kind of reference to compare correlation with, we need to introduce some kind of memory in this network, a way of knowing that if I'm paying attention to bird X, then somehow I need to map the activity across my network to the activity of what bird X on average should look like, and that should help me anchor activation across the nodes. So we've implemented that through different ways. One of the ways we've settled on is using non-negative matrix factorization. The simple way of thinking about it is if you take the activity of the network to a target sound that you're paying attention to, you can build a basis function using NMF that tells you this is a memory of what that target sound should look like. And now using that, we can implement a feedback that tells us once you see a new observation, can we adjust the activation of the nodes to increase correlation with the activation of our memory, of what we want to pay attention to. So sort of to put it all together, we first train the network. All it trains on is sort of a wide variety of sounds that gives us a representation of STRFs. Then we also learn some representation of our targets. What is it we're paying attention to? What is our goal of attention is? Those are represented in these memory units. And now when we get a new observation, the new observation is going to activate these different nodes, and now we can manipulate their activity, the activity across the different channels, to enhance the correlation with these memory measures that we've already obtained. So we wanted to test this kind of network. We've done different tests with different tasks. This is not a network that is trained on a specific task. It's trained on just a random set of data. It is trained to keep memory of individual sound targets of interest. So we tested this with kind of a scene classification kind of problem, but we think of it more of a detection of attended sound. So we use the urban sounds data set from NYU. What we basically do here is, let's say we want to pay attention to a siren. Our network has an average representation of what a siren sounds like. Sound comes in, and what it does is it tries to change the representation of these different RBM outputs to correlate best with an average representation of a siren. Now, we know that on this urban sounds data set, in a kind of scene classification setup, a CNN baseline gives about 80% accuracy. So we can distinguish these different sounds on average about 80% accuracy, and compared to that, our distributed network does about the same. So in gray here is what the CNN baseline looks like. In green is our distributed network with our STRFs without any attentional feedback. And the curve here is the same network, but now we introduce the attentional feedback, trying to modulate the coherence or the co-correlation between individual nodes. So overall, it does pretty much the same. But the benefit of this kind of attentional feedback really comes in when you have cocktail party-like setting. Now you're paying attention to a siren, but maybe there is more background noise than the original setup that was used to train these kinds of network. So as we introduced, so we've played with different kinds of noises. We've mixed scenes together. This would be a kind of additive noise. We added other noise from other databases together. We've added reverberation. So this is an average. What I'm showing you here is just average across many manipulations. And so as we add noise, so this is showing you the performance in terms of detecting different scenes relative to each other as we added different kinds of noises at 10 dB, 5 dB and 0 dB SNR, you see a kind of a drop in performance, which is expected. Now, when we test this against our sort of distributed system, it does drop in performance, though it seems to be a little bit more robust. We definitely get more robustness from the system when we implement the closed loop, the attentional feedback into it. So that's really the gain that I feel one can describe what attention brings to the table. I don't think it necessarily brings improved perception in normal settings, but certainly in noisy settings, you can expect sort of the robustness that the brain, the auditory system exhibits relative to computer sort of audio systems really comes in when you look at the robustness in noise. So overall, attentional feedback is really a pervasive mechanism. I touched on a couple of ways attentional feedback is actually implemented in the brain through the plasticity or the adaptation of individual filters, through adapting co-activation between neurons. But it is a way that is a mechanism used by our brain to improve perception of targets relative to maskers. It is important not to think of attention as a simple selection filter. It is very tempting to think of it as a selection filter. I know in a lot of sort of vision work, that's the way, a lot of ways, sometimes that attention is thought of. In many ways, in some of the deep learning configurations, this is how we think of attention, as kind of a selection filter. It really plays a role that is far beyond that. It's really reshaping the representation rather than just necessarily selecting, is it this one or that one? So when you think of how your individual features themselves are changed by attention, that's sort of a much deeper reconfiguration of the representation than just the representation doing its thing and then attention just saying, I think this is the target, this is not the target. So the work that we've been, sort of doing in terms of these models, we really don't understand a whole lot about how attention is really reshaping the system processing, but we do know that there are a number of strategies based on these models that I've shown you that it may in many ways push the perceptual maps of targets and maskers apart. It may tighten their perceptual representations. It might help anchor the analysis of noisy signals relative to what we have represented in memory. But in all likelihood, some combination of all these strategies are helping the brain and a lot of these models that I've shown you to tackle the cocktail party problem. So I'll just acknowledge the funding agencies that have supported this work, and I'll thank you for your attention.
Are there any questions for the speaker?
So I think another interesting aspect of the cocktail party is how spatially separated the talkers and the interferers are. So have you seen or would you expect to see adaptation in spatial filtering, or think of the brain acting like an adaptive beamformer, or is there something else going on in the spatial domain?
Yes, so there's certainly adaptation. So the kinds of STRF changes that I've shown you have been reported in spatial receptive fields when attention to different locations in space, just like you said, an adaptive beamformer. None of the work that I touched here talks about spatial hearing, but the same kinds of tuning that you imagine here in time frequency you also has been reported to happen in time space or time frequency space. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. The stability term in your objective function, I'm wondering, did you try anything else, and were they motivated by biological constraints?
Yes, so they are motivated by biological constraints. We do know that the changes in tuning parameters are really constrained. So it's not like, for example, think of a filter that has a sort of a best frequency response. It's not like that moves all the way. We're talking about changes on the bandwidth. So a little bump grows here. So we do know that the core structure of the filter shape does not change, and that's something that has inspired that work. To what extent we can balance the two, I don't think we have enough data. Like how much do you tune that down or up? That's something that can be explored.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was really fascinating. So from what I understand, your STRFs are models of individual neurons. I was wondering whether your model considers like the spatial location of neurons and their connectivity. Specifically, I was wondering because I have read papers about plasticity in somatosensory or motor cortices, where if you increase the representations, say for the hand, it decreases representations nearby. So I was wondering if you considered spatial location at all.
So I think you mean spatial location in terms of where they are in the brain as opposed to spatial location
So for
audio.
example, neighboring neurons
Right.
might have a more similar response function.
So the kinds of changes that you're talking about in motor cortex have also been reported in auditory cortex, but those tend to be more in kind of extended learning. So if I expose a brain to 1 kilohertz for a week, then definitely the region that represents 1 kilohertz is going to grow. So those have been reported. The kind of changes, and those are more like long-term kind of plasticity effects that take a while to redo, and sometimes they don't actually go back. These kinds of changes that I'm talking about, these are changes on the fly.
Okay.
They happen within minutes, and they go back. So all these neurons, I should mention, they go back to their initial state. So this is a state that they are in during the feedback phase, the active phase, and then they all go back to the way they were before.
Okay, so in your passive image that was taken before training, or?
So the way these recordings were done is the animals are trained on the task. So they learn to, when they are presented with these kinds of sounds, they lick water when they are presented with the target, and then they stop licking, or the other way around. So they are trained, and that's done. But then when you present them with the sound, not in the task, if it's just playing random noises, they're just sitting there and they're not behaving, and that's the passive state. When now you engage them in the task, you pull the water on, so now they're paying attention, then you see these kinds of changes. And then when they're done with the task and you just play random sounds in the background, that would be what we would call a passive state.
I see. So did you look at whether the response function changed before and after training, or you were only interested in the short-term?
So we're only looking at the short term. So there is actually some work going on in some labs that is looking during the actual training phase. That's sort of now looking at the encoding of the task instructions. That would be something that goes beyond just attentional feedback and looks at more cognitive, sort of instruction encoding and memory of that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, just one more quick question.
Sure.
So have you also considered whether looking at connectivity between neurons would increase the information that your model can?
Right, so the temporal coherence work that I've showed at the end is really looking at connectivity between neurons.
Yeah.
And though it hasn't been mapped out extensively in an actual brain where we can really look at lots of connections, but we do know that pairs of neurons that are, based on the co-activation would increase their sort of connectivity, and that's what we try to model in that later work.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.